This is the second of two lectures on Thomas Sankara. In the first lecture, we looked at his political orientation statement that he distributed and gave out right after he assumed control of Burkina Faso after the revolution, 1983. And we also talked about Sankara in a more general sense in terms of his life in the context of the Burkina Faso revolution at which he was at the helm. In this lecture, we're going to look at three specific speeches of Thomas Sankara. But the foundational material we discussed in the previous lecture, so you might be better off going and looking at that lecture first before you listen to this lecture, although they can be listened to separately. But he was, again, a Burkina Faso president, and he was in the military as well, got his start in the military, and he had a very interesting career, very short career, cut short because he was assassinated in a coup led by Blaise Compaoré, and that which led then to a period of almost 3 decades in which the Burkina Faso suffered under despotic rule. But in the case of Thomas Sankara, he was a revolutionary who who dedicated his life to the revolution and understood very well the risks that he ran and the possibility that he might be assassinated. But as Thomas Sankara was famous for saying, you can kill a person, but you can't kill ideas. And he felt confident that no matter what happened to him personally, that the revolution itself that he had inaugurated could not be stopped. And although there was this period of despotism in the aftermath of his demise, he remains today a figure who we could say the specter of Thomas Sankara continues to haunt West Africa, which is why you see images of him everywhere, because he offered a vision for a different kind of future for Africa and a different kind of future for Africans, one that was a hopeful vision, one that was not mired in Afro-pessimism, one that saw a future that could be bright and wonderful and would be totally independent and self-sustaining, free finally of European imperialism and neo-imperialism. Now, the speeches that I'm drawing from you'll find in Samantha Anderson's Thomas Sankara Speaks. This is a wonderful volume of lectures and interviews that Sankara gave, and so I urge you to get a copy of this and to study yourself the words of Thomas Sankara. Thankfully, these talks that he gave have been gathered together and translated into English, and this remains the best source that I'm aware of in the English language to learn information about Thomas Sankara and to let his words speak for themselves. There's a lot of, with political discourse, you get a lot of spin, you get a lot of different people that have different opinions, and a lot of analysts in the West did not like Thomas Sankara. They demonized him. They called him, Maoist, et cetera, et cetera. But I would just urge you, read his words, look at what he said, judge his words, let him speak for himself, and then come to your own conclusions about what you find him saying and about the kind of man that he was. Now, as I said in the last lecture, I lived in Burkina Faso from 1996 to 1997. This was after the period that Thomas Sankara had already been assassinated. I left Burkina Faso in the months before Norbert Zongo was also assassinated at the hands of the Compaoré regime. So it gave me a lot of insight into what he had tried to accomplish and what who and what the Burkina Faso people are. So I'll try to bring some of that information as well into this lecture. But unfortunately, Burkina Faso is going through a difficult period now. After the destabilization, which was a result of Barack Obama attacking Libya and then causing a kind of a domino effect in West Africa, which has directly harmed the people of Mali, the people of Burkina Faso. And so the Americans bear great deal of responsibility for what took place under the watch of Obama. And Burkina Faso has not yet recovered from this. They're still undergoing jihadist terrorist attacks from the north. And this when I lived there, that was unimaginable. It was just simply unimaginable. And so, if you're an American and you're listening to this, we as Americans bear some responsibility for what's happening in Mali and Burkina Faso. And, Thomas Sankara is a good place to start by beginning to understand that legacy that he left behind, and also to sort of rethink, what a proper response should be for those of us who live in the United States and are in a country in which our elected officials have adopted disastrous policies of regime change that have had so devastating effect on the lives of people, in this case in the Sahel. Now, the three talks that I'm going to be referencing, one is entitled "There is Only One Color," that of African Unity. This was actually an interview that was conducted in 1984. And then "Freedom Can Only Be Won Through Struggle." There's also a very interesting talk in the volume of Thomas Sankara Speaks, where entitled "Our White House is Black Harlem," because prior to Thomas Sankara giving this speech at the United Nations at the UN General Assembly in New York, he stopped first in Harlem and he spoke to the people of Harlem and expressed his solidarity with them as a Black African man. And that's also a nice talk. It's a very short talk. This one has a bit more substance to it, and it'll give us a sense of what his view was in terms of how he was a kind of a spokesman, or how he saw himself as a spokesman, not only for Burkina Faso, the people of Burkina Faso, but for all of the oppressed peoples of the world. Because you have to remember that Burkina Faso, along with, say, Mali and Niger, these are the three poorest countries in the world, and they have borne the brunt of imperialism, neo-imperialism, and they live in conditions which are very difficult for people who live in the United States and Europe to understand or to conceptualize. And so he saw himself as being in a position it was a responsibility for him not just to speak on behalf of the Burkinabe, but he encouraged people to think of Burkina Faso as a kind of a figure of oppressed peoples everywhere because of the burden that the Burkinabe bore. And so we'll look at how he thinks of that and conceptualizes that in his talk to the UN. And then finally, what many people feel is perhaps his most important talk of all, and that is his talk that he gave shortly before he was assassinated, entitled "The Revolution Cannot Triumph Without the Emancipation of Women," given at March 8th in 1987. This was a very interesting talk in which he makes a very strong case for women's emancipation and the role of women in the revolution and in Burkinabe society, which he saw as being necessarily completely equal to that of men. And his views at the time were, you got to remember, this was in 1987, and many people hardly even knew what to say. They were just flabbergasted at what he was saying. And so he was really very much a man ahead of his time. And so I encourage you to have a close look at this essay too, this talk that he gave in Ouagadougou. So let's start with his interview, "There is Only One Color," that of African Unity, published in 1984. And the question was posed to him: what is the state of relations with Cote d'Ivoire? And I'll try to give you some of the context for why this question is being asked. And I think you'll see that it's an important question. But first, let's look at his response. So he's going to say, of course, we have opponents in the Ivory Coast, or Cote d'Ivoire, many of them. But as revolutionaries, we understand that whereas we became revolutionaries, the world we have to live with is not revolutionary. And we live with the reality that is not always to our liking. But as soon as we accept that Ivory Coast is not making a revolution and that we are, everything becomes simple. Every citizen in the Ivory Coast who loves the people of Burkina Faso should applaud the revolution. And anyone who dislikes our revolution does not love the Burkinabe people. This is where you must start in order to know where the coldness in this relationship is located and who exactly is getting cold. Does this mean that the Ivory Coast had excellent relations with reactionary Upper Volta and suddenly is getting cool because Upper Volta has become revolutionary? That's a question that can be answered only in the Ivory Coast. Burkina lives in the warmth of the revolution. Okay, so let's put this in context. What is he talking about? Again, I'm assuming that most of you who are listening to this lecture aren't that familiar with African politics and the history of colonization in Africa. For the people of Burkina Faso, though, they would know exactly what was going on in this question. But let's unpack it for just a minute here. So if you look on the right, you see a map in the yellow there, yellowish brown. There's Burkina Faso. And beneath it, you see Togo, Ghana, and Cote d'Ivoire, or the Ivory Coast, which is being asked about. Now, and then I've placed a picture here of the railway, the train, and the train station that goes from Abidjan in the far south on the coast of Cote d'Ivoire, or the Ivory Coast, and Ouagadougou, and actually goes up even a little further north to Kaya in Burkina Faso. So now it was the French that built this railway, this train line. Simbane Ousmane has a novel about the building of a similar kind of train in Senegal. But the French built this railway system, and they built it not really to serve the interest of the Burkinabe, but to serve the interests of France. So the context of this question is this. Cote d'Ivoire was, like Burkina Faso, or the former Upper Volta, which became Burkina Faso, was a colony of France. And France saw Cote d'Ivoire as a kind of a flagship colony. And so they put a lot of money into the development of Cote d'Ivoire, including the development of this railway system, which was essentially built to not just to provide easy transportation, but to make the exploitation of this part of Africa easier. And so what ended up happening was that whereas Cote d'Ivoire, particularly places like Abidjan, the capital, assumed a kind of an urban and modern character, Burkina Faso was left by the French in a state of indifferent underdevelopment. And then the people of Burkina Faso were used by the French as cheap labor to exploit or to develop Cote d'Ivoire, but not Burkina Faso. And one legacy of this today is you have, I think, over 1 million people living in Cote d'Ivoire who were either ancestors or were part of this forced migration, in effect, or this migration for the sake of labor earning a buck, where the Burkinabe went to Cote d'Ivoire to develop Cote d'Ivoire on behalf of the French. And many of these citizens lost their, they've lost a lot of their connections with Burkina Faso over the decades. And then in Cote d'Ivoire, they're looked at as, migrant laborers who are not welcome, and cheap labor that, that the French used or exploited, and then were no longer welcomed in the when they weren't useful, but then had nowhere to go. So the question, in his response to the question, he's saying, well, why is Cote d'Ivoire? Is there not a warm relations anymore between these two countries? Well, again, remember, Cote d'Ivoire colonized by the French, flagship colony. Burkina also colonized by the French, but left in a kind of a state of rural underdevelopment. Now, Ghana, right below Ouagadougou and Burkina Faso, was a colony of the British, and the French, certainly did not encourage relations between Burkina Faso and Ghana because Ghana was, considered to be sort of hands off. It was the property of the British. They wanted Burkina to be in this close relationship with Cote d'Ivoire. So when the revolution happened, of course, Thomas Sankara was not interested in continuing that exploitive relationship between Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire. This didn't make Cote d'Ivoire very happy. It also didn't make France very happy either. And then Sankara and Burkina, after the revolution, developed a closer relationship with Ghana, and this sort of tipped over the apple cart in terms of the neo-colonial plan that France had for Burkina Faso. Now here is a picture of Félix Houphouet-Boigny, born in 1905 through 1993. He was the French puppet in Abidjan. He was a piece of work, I'll tell you. I mean, he built this. If you look in the middle of this of these three images, this is an image of a cathedral that he built in his village in Yamoussoukro, which is about halfway in the middle of the country. It's an enormous Catholic cathedral. Like Leopold Sédar Senghor, he was a Catholic. He converted to Catholicism. Now, in the case of Senegal with Senghor, Senegal is predominantly Muslim with a very small Christian population. There are more Christians in Cote d'Ivoire, but they mostly live in the south. And so in the case of, whereas the Muslim population is more in the north. So when he built this enormous cathedral, he did it in a context where there were hardly any Catholics. And this cathedral was built exactly as a replica of the Vatican, although it was actually bigger than the Vatican. The church, the Catholic Church, had asked Houphouet-Boigny not to make it bigger than the Vatican, but he didn't. He did anyway. And those two houses you see out there on each side of it, well, one of them is for the Pope, and Pope has stayed there once. So it's it's an enormous white elephant, and you can see there on the far right the stained glass. Now, when you go inside, I visited this cathedral many years ago. Most of the iconography and the stained glass. It is an impressive cathedral, but it's all a lot of white-looking, cherub, angel figures. Except for, if you can see here in this final panel in the stained glass, you see the man kneeling with a brown face. That Houphouet-Boigny had himself placed into this stained glass, and he built this enormous white elephant right there in the middle of Cote d'Ivoire, where hardly anybody goes to it because there aren't even that many Catholics. I mean, there are celebrations that Catholics from the region will go to, but on a weekly basis, they're not enough people to fill that cathedral. That's for sure. But he saw himself as getting a tremendous blessing from God for having built this cathedral. But he did so, but to do so, he had to bankrupt the economy of Cote d'Ivoire. And this is a problem in Africa of these dictators, these small-minded dictators who prefer to build these enormous monuments rather than using the money to help develop their own people and the livelihoods of their own people, their education, their well-being, and so on. So this you can go visit this cathedral. It's quite interesting. But now Houphouet-Boigny, as you're going to see, he was the one who gave the green light to Blaise Compaoré to kill Thomas Sankara. Thomas Sankara, he had this, because this difficult relationship had developed, as we saw in the response that Sankara gave. Houphouet-Boigny, as the French puppet in Cote d'Ivoire, was looking at this revolution going on in Burkina Faso, and he didn't really like what he was seeing very much. And then Blaise Compaoré, who was the murderer who ended up, killing Sankara in the coup or ordering Sankara's execution, was married to the daughter of Félix Houphouet-Boigny. Now she was some say the adopted daughter, but she was probably, the evidence seems to indicate that he was the father. She was an illegitimate child that then he adopted, but she was actually the biological child as well. In any case, whether she was the biological child or merely the adopted child of Houphouet-Boigny, she had very close relationships with him, and so she became a kind of in her relationship with her husband, this became a kind of a conduit. This was after Compaoré had Sankara killed. Of course, one of the first things that he did was to reestablish close relationship with Côte d'Ivoire and with Félix Houphouet-Boigny. And so when Compaoré was chased out of the country after all his years of despotism in 2014, the French made sure that he was safe and that he was safely escorted of course, to Côte d'Ivoire, where he lives today in exile. Now, here are some more images of the cathedral at Yamoussoukro. And you can see there on the image on the left in the map, you can see where Yamoussoukro is located. And then on the bottom of that, you can see the enormity of this cathedral. And it is astounding. When I visited there some years ago, if you look at those pillars, it's hard to get a sense of the scale of this. But if you look at those pillars in this Vatican-like structure that he had built, it's essentially a replica of the Vatican. You can see that on the far right. You see the same kind of bird, it's slightly different, but same kind of bird at the center of the cathedral that was developed by, or was the architecture of whom was Michelangelo. And but like I said, those pillars are so big. It could take about 4 or 5 people just to, could link arms around those pillars, and you still probably couldn't get all around it. It might take 6 or 7. But it is a magnificent building, which largely sits empty in an impoverished village in an impoverished country that was, essentially bankrupted by this corrupt president who finally gave Compaoré the green light to assassinate Thomas Sankara. So Compaoré is responsible, but so is Houphouet-Boigny for derailing this experiment that had been launched in Burkina Faso. Now here you can see this is the cathedral in Abidjan. Arguably you could say, well, there's more justification for this cathedral because you do have a slightly, you have some Catholic population in Abidjan. This one doesn't always sit empty in the way the one in Yamoussoukro does. It's quite interesting when you go inside. If you look at the stained glass, you can see on the bottom image in the middle. You see you have a European bearded missionary arriving on a boat, and then he's being greeted by, it looks like an Edenic paradise of something out of The Lion King or something, with women with baskets of fruit on their head, and it's all very wonderful. And the church itself is built in the shape of a ship or a big boat, like it's landed on the shore and brought the gospel to Africa in this celebratory way. So Senghor, it's interesting how a lot of the French despots like Senghor and Houphouet-Boigny were in effect, Catholics, and that was part of how and why they became, as comprador figures, how they became installed in positions of power. Now, Senghor was not quite the despot that Houphouet-Boigny was, but some of his policies were quite oppressive. So in any case, let's continue. Here's Chantal Compaoré on the left. You can see she was born in 1961. She's still alive, living in exile with her husband in Ivory Coast, Blaise Compaoré. Thomas Sankara actually attended the wedding of Blaise Compaoré and Houphouet-Boigny's daughter. If Sankara is to be faulted, he was perhaps a little bit naive in not being more attentive to the threat that this relationship posed to him. Now on the right, you can see there Barack Obama with Blaise Compaoré and Chantal Compaoré, and also Michelle Obama. It's interesting. People criticize Trump as they should for his close relationship or his visits to South or North Korea or South Korea, his conversations with Kim Jong Un, and how he gets cozy with Vladimir Putin, how he seems to like dictators. But I think it should be noted that Barack Obama also was quite friendly to Blaise Compaoré and other African dictators as well. And there's a sense in which Blaise Compaoré makes Kim Jong Un look like a Eagle Scout. He was not he was not a nice person. Let's put it that way. But it's interesting how none of this ever made it into the media. A man who killed many people, but I guess nobody thought that it mattered at the time. Okay, another question that was placed to Thomas Sankara. In contrast to Ivory Coast, Ghana and its president are always welcome in Burkina Faso. Could Ghana become a weight on your young country? Now he's being asked this because Ghana, Jerry Rawlings in Ghana, the leader of Ghana, was a Marxist like Sankara was, and Sankara was developing an alliance that France was mortified at the very thought of this. And so here we have the second part of the same question. And here's what Sankara says. He says, Ghana comes to Burkina Faso and demonstrates with us. So with us whenever it's called for us on happy and sometimes not so happy occasions. This is because, and we have no doubts, the peoples of Ghana and Burkina Faso are kindred spirits. The example of Ghana and Burkina Faso is one that we would like to see multiplied many times over. Those who feel endangered by this are perhaps those who would like to see Ghana against Burkina Faso for their own ulterior motives. And who would this be? Well, we know for starters, it's not just Félix Houphouet-Boigny in Côte d'Ivoire. It's France. It's Britain. This close relationship between Ghana had been colonized by the British and then had become socialist, and Burkina Faso that was colonized by the French and had become socialist. This set off alarm bells in the capitals of Europe. But Thomas Sankara said, no, we're not going to continue these kinds of exploitative relationships that have existed in the past. So he completely changed Burkina Faso's foreign policy as well. Now here you can see a picture of Jerry Rawlings, his close friendship with Thomas Sankara. Now after Blaise Compaoré, killed Thomas Sankara or had him killed, Jerry Rawlings in Ghana completely cut off relations with Burkina Faso, except for very minimal relations. You can see there beneath Upper Volta what's called the Gold Coast. This was what became Ghana. Ghana took its name from the old Ghana Empire. There were two different. Old Ghana Empire was located further up in what would be Mali today, but this was a colony of the British. Here's a picture of Jerry Rawlings. He's still alive. He was born in 1947. He was president of Ghana from 1981 to 2001. And you can see there in the center Sankara and Rawlings in their close relationship. They held demonstrations together, military demonstrations. There is Castro with Rawlings. And then you see on the far left, and there's Castro with Sankara on the far right, giving him the award of the Jose Marti Award in one of the trips that Sankara took to Cuba. So all of this was very worrisome to France, very worrisome to the United States as well. Now, Thomas Sankara also had relations with Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, and one of the things that they had in common was that they were both assassinated. In the case of Gaddafi, it was Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State during the Obama administration that oversaw the rape and murder of Gaddafi. The claim, of course, was that these were elements that were not under the control of the U.S. State Department, but there's an infamous video of Hillary Clinton laughing with glee and saying something to the effect of, "We came, we saw, he died," and then just giggling about this murder of a sovereign African head of state. It's very, shocking. And the United States, when Obama bombed Libya and destabilized the region, he did so, on humanitarian grounds of all things, and devastated Libya, set off this chain this sort of domino effect, chain of events that occurred that destabilized northern Mali, led to the establishment of this short-lived nation of Azawad, which then caused the French to come back with the military presence. It's caused this destabilization that's still ongoing in Burkina Faso, which I have to say, as someone who lived there, it's such a tragedy. I went and visited. Last time I was in Burkina Faso was in 2014, and I was shocked at what I saw, the differences in what had happened in that country, and what had been such a nice and wonderful country, and the political uncertainty that was caused as a result of, first, the dictatorship of Blaise Compaoré, but secondly, the disastrous policy of Obama to attack Libya along with the support of NATO. Now, Gaddafi was not a good guy either, and he had many problems with Gaddafi. But he was a sovereign head of state who was murdered in an extrajudicial sense or assassinated. And he poured money into Burkina Faso, he poured money into Mali, and his relationship with Sankara, it wasn't great. And then towards the end, it grew. There were some tensions between them, but he was also a figure that Thomas Sankara was in dialogue with, as was necessary for those who were African, whose neighbors were so close by in this context. Now, here's another question that was placed to Sankara. He said, "Your colleague from Zaire." Now, we know who this is. I placed a picture of him, Mobutu, with his leopard skin cap there, brutal dictator in Zaire who had Patrice Lumumba killed. And as I said in the previous lectures, Norbert Zongo coined this term, Mobutuization. This is the figure, sort of although there are a lot of brutal African dictators, this guy takes the cake. But here was the question. Your colleague from Zaire has recently demanded the setting up of a League of Black African States. Were you consulted on this, and what do you think of this initiative by President Mobutu? Specifically, do you think this is an answer to the problems Black Africa is facing? And do you think that the conflicts in the Western Sahara and Chad are the cause of the OAU's, or the Organization of African Unity, current difficulties? Now, Gaddafi was involved in the OAU, and if we go back and look at this image here, you can see him on the far left in more African garb. Sometimes Gaddafi would sort of play the Arab card and be involved with the Pan-Arab movement, and but sometimes he would assert African identity. In fact, he wasn't black, he wasn't Arab either. He was Berber, but he was also politically, he was very crafty. He was involved in the OAU, the African Organization of Unity. And so the far north of Africa there are Arab peoples, there are Berber peoples, there are Tuareg, and then as you get further down the Sahara, the population shifts and becomes more black. And so when we talk about African unity, we're talking about unity of peoples of many different colors. And in Burkina, there's a Tuareg population in Burkina, as there is in Mali, and an Arab population as well, which is, say, a Berber and an Arab population. And so to talk of African unity is to talk about a kind of unity that is not simply a Pan-African unity, if we're thinking of African identity as being, strictly speaking, black. And so the context of the question is well, Mobutu in Zaire wants to develop a Black African unity organization, and Sankara he is closer in terms of his border to non-Black African peoples, and so his idea of African unity is not, strictly speaking, one based on color. Okay, so now here, if you look at this map here, is a map of the Sahara Desert, where you can see these states in the Sahel zone, for instance, that of so many different mixed ethnic groups or people of different colors or racial identities, whatever term you want to use. And He's being asked about, how the difficulty of forming a North-South alliance, which has always been difficult to achieve. Ali Masri speaks of what he calls Afrabia. He wants to articulate a common identity, which he calls an Afrabian identity, merging together, Arab and African identity. But that's a beautiful dream. But in theory, it's always been a little bit more difficult to accomplish. And so this is the context of what Sankara is being asked in this question. Now, if you look in the center, the reference to the Western Sahara, the Western Sahara is a state that Morocco for many years has tried to colonize, and what they're doing is they're building a railway and sending. They encourage their people to go down there. It's very, I would say, it's quite akin to what the Israelis are doing in the West Bank in the colonial settler model. And they're also trying to encourage transportation down there, so that eventually when they get enough people that are Moroccan down into the Western Sahara, they can hold a referendum and then annex the Western Sahara to Morocco. Which, as you can see, if you look to the far left, Morocco, which is already about the size of the state of California, and then you got Western Sahara below it. So if Morocco were to expand that far to the south, it would be quite a colonial expansion for them. And this is a kingdom that is ruled by an Arab sovereign, and so this is seen from a southward perspective as of being an instance of Arab colonization. There's a long history of Arab imperialism, Arab colonization, Arab racism, Arab slavery in this part of Africa as well. So this is the context of what he's being asked, because, of course, the people of Western Sahara are not particularly happy about this. Here's what Sankara responds. He says, "We are not opposed to Africans who are black regrouping among themselves, given the fact that there are black and white Africans. But we don't really see what this would accomplish. We don't know what purpose it would serve to keep repeating that we are black, as if the problems of the OAU, or the African Unity Organization, arise because it is two-colored, when we should be thinking of forming a one-colored organization. So it's not a question of color. In terms of component organizations of the OAU, there is no place for the color sensitive. There is only one color, that of African unity." And so you can see here that he doesn't want to, it's not like when he goes to Harlem and gives his speech, he says, Harlem is our black White House. He wants to affirm his solidarity with black Americans living in Harlem, but at the same time, his ideology is not, strictly speaking, a race-centered ideology. It's his vision of Africa is an Africa that is unified and is not predicated simply on the question of color. So we could say, well, in some sense, we could say, class. This is the sense in which Sankara is a Marxist, in the sense that class is finally he wants people to be sensitive to the question of color, but finally the question of class or economics trumps that of color. Color becomes a function of the economic. Now, when he is at the UN, this is a talk that he gave on October 4th, 1984. The name of this talk was "Freedom Can Be Won Only Through Struggle." And it's a wonderful talk, which I encourage you to read very carefully. But we'll take out a few passages for it, and we'll see how he places Burkina Faso at the center of this revolutionary paradigm, as a kind of a figure or an allegory of a people who are very poor and who have been oppressed, and as such are in a position to speak in the name of others who suffer similar forms of oppression. And here he starts out his talk. He says, "Mr. President, I make no claim to set forth doctrines here. I am neither Messiah nor prophet. I possess no truths. My goal is twofold. First, to be able to speak on behalf of my people, the people of Burkina Faso, in simple words, in the language of facts and clarity. And second, in my own way, to speak for the great disinherited people of the world, so disparagingly named the Third World. Now, he does say here he's not particularly comfortable with this term, the Third World, which it does imply non-alignment, but it has a kind of a negative, pejorative connotation as well. But he embraces it and says, okay, yes, I'm here on behalf of the disinherited people of the Third World. He says, until now we have turned the other cheek. The blows were redoubled. The evil heart did not soften. The word of Christ was betrayed, and his cross was transformed into a club. They, or the colonizers, put on his robe and tore our bodies and souls apart. Now, this is again the reference to the way in which Christianity served the interest of the French imperialists. In the case of Burkina Faso, the Catholic interpretation of Christianity and the priestly caste that came from Europe to promote Christianity, but how it was used to further the imperial interests of the French in Burkina Faso. Now, here's his description of Burkina Faso. He says, a few simple words to describe the former Upper Volta, to put it in perspective. A country with 7 million inhabitants, more than 6 million of whom are peasants. Now, this is about the size of the state of Washington. An infant mortality rate estimated at 180 per 1,000. Now think about this. Out of every 1,000 children, 180 die. It's a pretty high infant mortality rate. And we're really worried about COVID right now. Burkina Faso has had these kinds of worries for a very long time. An average life expectancy of only 40 years. Now think about that. 40 years life expectancy, one doctor for 50,000 inhabitants, a school attendance rate of only 16%, and finally a gross domestic product of barely over $100. The diagnosis before us was somber. The cause of the illness was political. The cure could only be political. My country is the quintessence of all the misfortunes of the peoples, a painful synthesis of all of humanity's sufferings, but also and above all, a synthesis of the promise of its struggles. So it's really interesting how he allegorizes Burkina Faso as a figure of all of those people who have suffered and who are struggling. And yet who hold out the promise of revolutionary change, of a better future, a future not in which it's not simply hopeless. Now here's Sankara's position on foreign aid. Now remember, as I said in the last lecture, he drove out the Peace Corps. He doesn't want NGOs or aid organizations that prolong Burkina Faso's underdevelopment. He says, we encourage aid that helps us to overcome the need for aid. But in general, the policy of foreign aid and assistance produced nothing but disorganization and continued enslavement. It robbed us of our sense of responsibility for our own economic and political and cultural territory. We chose to risk new paths to achieve greater happiness. Very few countries, he says, have been as inundated as Burkina Faso with every conceivable form of aid. Theoretically, this aid is supposed to work in favor of our development, but the only goal of foreign aid is to continue developing non-productive sectors, imposing unbearable burdens on our meager budgets, disorganizing our countryside, increasing the deficits in our balance of trade, and accelerated our indebtedness. So if you think about what he really wants, he doesn't want NGOs, he doesn't want foreign assistance, he wants Burkina Faso to be completely self-sufficient. He wants, for instance, the crops to serve the needs of the Burkinabe rather than to grow crops to be exported to France. If Burkina Faso can become totally autonomous and independent, self-sustaining, it won't need foreign assistance. And he says, look, we don't have a lot, but we can work. We're hard workers, and we are people of integrity, and we don't want with thanks but no thanks. We don't want your handouts. We want to do it ourselves. Well, why would this be so threatening to France? This is a question worth thinking about, a question worth asking when one considers the role of NGOs in developing and so-called developing African countries. Now, I'll give you an example. I have a Senegal program that I run here in my university, and we go to Senegal every year. And when I developed this program, I deliberately and explicitly developed it and I had to fight with off this notion among my students and others that, so look, we're not going to Senegal because people need our assistance. There's this sort of missionary mentality that even among people who are not Christian in the United States, that think that the only reason to go to Africa is to dig a well or to help people, to bring food to starving children, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea that you can go to Africa because you can learn from it, that you can get that Africa has something to give to you, it's still, and here we are in 2020, and it's still a hard notion for many people to accept. Who are ignorant of the circumstances of the continent. So this is an ongoing situation, but Sankara was very aware of this problem. He said, we don't want your NGOs, and this included for him the Peace Corps. Well, thank you, but we'll do it ourselves, was his attitude. Our revolution in Burkina Faso embraces the misfortunes of all peoples. It draws on the totality of man's experiences since the first breath of humanity. We wish to be heirs of all the revolutions of the world and of all the liberation struggles of the Third World. Of all the human races, we belong to those who have suffered the most. We, Burkinabe, have sworn never again to accept the smallest injustice in even the smallest corner of the earth. So I think this might give you some sense of why some people would be, frightened and disturbed at what he had to say, and others very, very inspired by this rhetoric. This was the reason I went to Burkina Faso, to be quite frank. I wanted to see this experiment that he had launched, and I think that the people of Burkina Faso had launched, and I think that Burkina Faso remains. This is not just a thing of the past; it remains an emblematic instance of decolonization that the world, I think, can look to and learn from. And the murder of Sankara and the installment of Compaoré by the French is, just provides more evidence of what Sankara is saying here, is that the Burkinabe have suffered terrible injustice. He says, I speak not only in the name of my beloved Burkina Faso, but also in the name of all those who are suffering in any corner of the world. I speak in the name of the millions who live in ghettos because they have black skin or because they come from different cultures and whose status is barely better than that of an animal. I suffer in the name of he even speaks here of America, he's speaking of American Indians, Native Americans, who have been massacred, crushed, humiliated, and confined for centuries on reservations. I speak out in the name of those thrown out of work by a system that is structurally unjust and periodically in crisis, whose only view of life is a reflection of that of the affluent. The 1%, as we say in the United States. I speak on behalf of women of the world over who suffer at the hands of a male-imposed system. Women in struggle proclaim in unison with us that the slave who does not organize his own rebellion deserves no pity for his lot. He alone is responsible for his misfortune if he harbors illusions in the dubious assurance of a master's promise of freedom. Freedom can only be won through struggle, and we call on all our sisters of all races to rise to the assault and fight to conquer their rights. All right, so this is very similar to what Fanon says in Wretched of the Earth, that freedom can only be won by struggle. Nobody's going to give you your freedom. You have to fight for it. If you wait for them to give it to you, you're going to be waiting for a very long time. I speak on behalf of the mothers in our impoverished countries who watch their children die of malaria or diarrhea, ignorant of the fact that there are simple ways to save them. The science of the multinationals, however, keeps this knowledge from them, preferring instead to serve the cosmetic laboratories and provide plastic surgery to satisfy the whims of a few men and women whose charm is threatened by the excess of calories in their meals. I speak too in the name of the child, the hungry child of the poor, who furtively eyes the accumulation of abundance in the rich man's stores, protected by a policeman in helmet and gloves, armed with a billy club. And I'll just give you one, instance of this in Sankara's own life. When he was a boy, he speaks of how a French kid had this bicycle, and every kid in the school just dreamed about riding that bicycle. It became a kind of a fetish object for all the children of the school. And he finally, as a young boy, got so fed up that he just took the bike and rode off on it. And he was, I think, 10 or 11. But the response of the authorities was to place his father in jail for this. This is pathetic. But this is, a reality that he himself lived through in Burkina Faso. I speak out in indignation, thinking about the Palestinians, whom an unjust humanity has replaced with another people, a people only yesterday martyred at will. The Palestinians, along with their Jewish brothers, oppose Zionism. Israel must learn that peace for them cannot be achieved through military might financed from abroad. Israel must begin to learn how to become a nation like others and with others. We also believe that the fate meted out to the people of Western Sahara by the Kingdom of Morocco is intolerable, and we condemn it unconditionally. So there we've discussed the incident, the question of Western Sahara. That still is happening, and so is the settler colonialism in Palestine. The Israelis are doing the exact same thing that the Moroccans are doing in Western Sahara. And it's what is happening to Palestinians remains very terrible. Palestinians are suffering a lot, and so it's kind of sad to think that after all these years, nothing has really changed in that regard. In fact, the situation for the Palestinians has become even worse. But Sankara, as we discussed in the last lecture, rejected the feudal ideology of the nobility in his country, this sort of blood nobility mentality. And he's speaking, as Edward Said argued in the case of the Palestinians, he quoted Nelson Mandela, who helped bring an end to apartheid by this mantra of one person, one vote, rather than an idea of citizenship based on one's, blood heritage or so-called religious identity. And of course, if this one person, one vote policy were instituted in Palestine, it might very well be of the end of Zionism. So this is something that, again, remains a problem, and Sankara is very much aware of this. Now, this is a photograph I took in Burkina Faso. This was a woman who came by with her family and sold. We bought fruit from her every day. Very nice, lovely person, lovely family. And I wanted to see. I bring in some of these images from the time that I was there, just through, we're looking at ideas here, concepts, but we're talking about real people, and these are policies, political decisions made by leaders, imperialists, and so on, neo-imperialists, that affect the lives of very real people, and I think that's important to keep in mind. But let's take a look now at Sankara's "The Revolution Cannot Triumph Without the Emancipation of Women." This was one of the final talks that he gave before Compaoré had him murdered. This was given on International Women's Day in Ouagadougou in March 8, 1987. This talk that he gave remains very inspirational to many, and is one that people still continue to meditate on and think about in relation to the future development of Africa and the emancipation of its women. It's one of those talks that just makes people say, wow, he just was certainly ahead of his time. That is for sure. A true visionary. Here's how he begins his talk. He says, "It's not an everyday occurrence for a man to speak to so very many women at once. Nor does it happen every day that a man suggests to so many women new battles to be joined. A man experiences his first bashfulness the minute he becomes conscious that he is looking at a woman. So, sisters, you will understand that despite the joy and the pleasure it gives me to be speaking to you, I still remain a man who sees in every one of you a mother, a sister, or a wife. You are our mothers and life companions, our comrades in struggle. And because of this fact, you should, by rights, I'm sorry, I must have cut some of this out here. But in any case, you get the gist of it. And it's very, very moving in many ways. If you look at the pictures of the beautiful women of Burkina Faso, whom he's referencing in his talk here, one thinks of recent, what's happened in the United States very recently in the context of this lecture just a couple of months ago, with what happened in Minneapolis and the dying words of this man who was killed by a police officer, appealing to his mother. It certainly gives us pause. And Sankara was a man who was cognizant of the value of women, and he really was a man who urged the Burkinabe women to rise up for themselves and themselves rise up, not him doing it for them, in order to help achieve true emancipation, not just for women, but for the men of Burkina Faso as well. So here's what he says. He says, posing the question of women in Burkinabe society today means posing the abolition of the system of slavery to which they have been subjected for millennia. We must understand the struggle of the Burkinabe woman is part of a worldwide struggle of all women, and beyond that, part of the struggle for the full rehabilitation of our continent. Thus, women's emancipation is at the heart of the question of humanity itself, here and everywhere. The question is thus universal in character. Women's consciousness of herself, though, he says, is not only a product of her sexuality. It reflects her position as determined by the economic structure of society, which in turn expresses the level reached by humankind in technological development and relations between classes. Inequality can be done away with only by establishing a new society where men and women will enjoy equal rights, resulting from an upheaval in the means of production and in all social relations. Thus, the status of women will improve only with the elimination of the system that exploits them. So as we saw in the question of the African unity and race, the question of race consciousness, he's going to similarly say here that that the consciousness of a woman or a man is not simply produced by his or her sexuality. In the same way, our consciousness is not strictly a product of our race, but it reflects, again, a position determined by economic structure. And so, finally, the question of class and the economic, what in Marxist terms one might call the economic base, is determinant for Sankara. But he's also aware that it's not, in the same way we could say that, Fanon's going to say Marx has to be adjusted for the African situation because European theorists of economic oppression are often oblivious to the question not only of imperialism but of race consciousness as well, the fact of racial oppression. So too, what the consciousness of women or the women's position can't strictly be reduced to class either. It's because woman's oppression is a kind of a double oppression, as he's going to say. He's going to say, but the condition of a woman's life are determined by more than economic factors. And they show that she is a victim of a specific oppression, which cannot be accounted for simply in class terms or economic terms. In addition to the class exploitation common to both men and women, women must confront a particular set of relations that exist between them and men, relations of conflict and violence that use as their pretext physical differences. We have little choice but to recognize that masculine behavior comprises vanity, irresponsibility, arrogance, and violence of all kinds towards women. This masculine foolishness is called sexism or machismo. It includes all kinds of moral and intellectual feebleness. This masculine society, Sankara states, needs female prostitutes. We say that both the female and the prostitutes are scapegoats. We defile them, and when we are done with them, we sacrifice them on the altar of prosperity, of a system of lies and plunder. Prostitution is nothing but the microcosm of a society where exploitation is a general rule. It is a symbol of the contempt men have for women. The only difference between the woman who sells her body by prostitution and she who sells herself in marriage is the price and duration of the contract. We should see in every prostitute an accusing finger pointing firmly at society as a whole. In fighting against prostitution, we are saving our mothers, our sisters, and our wives from this social liberty. We are saving ourselves. So, very strong words of condemnation indeed. And there are many different views about prostitution today and sex workers, but Sankara was certainly opposed to prostitution. He saw underneath it a kind of a social problem that was a microcosm again of exploitation of women in society in general. Emancipation, like freedom, is not granted but conquered, Sankara states. It is for women themselves to put forward their demands and mobilize to win them. Step by step, the women of Burkina have gained a foothold everywhere, are asserting themselves and demolishing all the male chauvinist backward conceptions of men. For 3.5 years, our revolution has worked to systematically eliminate all practices that demean women, such as prostitution and related activity like vagrancy and female juvenile delinquency, forced marriages, female circumcision or FGM, and their particularly difficult living conditions. Now, I mentioned in passing with respect to the question of FGM or female circumcision, this is this is at the time that he gave this speech, something like 95% of Burkina Faso women would have undergone FGM, and today the vast majority of women in Burkina Faso continue to undergo this, and so he was very much opposed to this form of ritual cutting. He says, and what about housework? This all-consuming, brutalizing work that has a tendency to turn you into robots and leave no time or energy to think. This is why we need resolute action directed toward men and in implementing a large-scale network of social services such as nurseries, daycare centers, and cafeterias. This would allow women to more easily take part in revolutionary debate and action. Each child, whether rejected as the mother's failure or doted on as the father's pride, should be of concern to society as a whole. Everyone the object of society's affection and attention. Men and women will from now on share all the tasks in the home. Now, this is a message which was quite, I think that left a lot of people in the context and the era at which he gave it, left a lot of people scratching their head. But you can see the ideas are very progressive, very sound ideas, large scale of networks, daycare centers, cafeterias, sharing parental responsibility, sharing the tasks of work in the home. And remember, too, in this context, this is not a world where people have dishwashing machines and dryers and washers for clothes. This is a world in which you pound your millet and housework is cooking and so on. It was not an easy task. It remains not an easy task. It's you wake up and you do it from the crack of dawn to the moment you go to sleep at night. He also states, society has imposed on women norms of beauty that violate the integrity of their body, such as female circumcision, scarring, the filing of teeth, and the piercing of lips and noses. Practicing these norms is of dubious value. In the case of female circumcision, it can even endanger a woman's ability to have children and affect her emotional life. Because it entails FGM entails in its more strict forms the removal of the clitoris and the sewing up of the labia. And indeed, many women have died in undergoing this, and also all kinds of complications in childbirth and other health issues down the road as a result of it. Other types of bodily mutilation, though less dangerous, like the piercing of ears and tattoos, are no less an expression of women's conditioning imposed by society if a woman wants a husband. Sisters, you make a great effort to win a husband. You pierce your ears and do violence to your body to be acceptable to men. You hurt yourselves so that the men can hurt you even more. Well, Simbain Ousmane was also, like Thomas Sankara, was very much opposed to FGM. And if you're interested in exploring this question further, the film Mulade is a film definitely worth a look, where he again presents this issue, and it's not, he's not presenting it by any means in a neutral way here in this film. Like Sankara, he's militating for its abolition. Sankara, let our women move up to the front ranks. Our final victory depends essentially on their capacities, their wisdom in struggle, their determination to win. Let the woman remember what she is capable of, that she is the center of the world. Let each one remember that she lives in the world for the world. He who does not love women, who does not respect women, who does not honor women, despised his own mother. Thus he who despises women destroys the very place from which he is born. No revolution, beginning with our own, can triumph without first liberating women. There is no true social revolution without the liberation of women. May my eyes never see and my feet never take me to a society where half the people are held in silence. Now, of course, we're getting this through the words of a man, but a man who is urging women to speak. Sankara, again, as I said, was often thought of as the Che Guevara of Africa, and he was killed in 1987, Guevara 20 years earlier in 1967. You will see images of both of them across Africa, and they both remain inspirational figures for many. Sankara is buried today in Burkina Faso, in Ouagadougou, not far from the grave also of Norbert Zongo, who was also killed, the journalist who was killed by Blaise Compaoré, or his brother Francis Compaoré. The justice for both Sankara and Zongo remains elusive. However, Compaoré is no longer president of Burkina Faso, and this is certainly a step in the right direction.